Look at that. We got Victoria online for posterity talked about. All right, so today we're going to continue our journey through the contract, which, as we all know at this point, is getting ready to change coming up here, but the changes won't impact this really. So it'll be interesting to kind of see what those are, but we'll get those obviously in June when we start talking about that. All right, so let's go right into, we're going to do the counter, terminating, and reinstating. So there's a couple of bonus ones. I know, pretty exciting. There's some bonus ones in here as well. So let's talk about the counteroffer. So I had this conversation with someone the other day. They were dealing with having to get a clean contract written, and they had an original offer and a counteroffer signed. And I was like, what? Why? Like, that's the whole point of this form, is to eliminate having to do that. Although it does talk about it here, and we'll talk about it here in a second. So you'll notice that at the top of the counteroffer, one of the things I like to point out about the counteroffer is there's no numbers. There's no counteroffer 1, counteroffer 2, counteroffer whatever, right? Because the only counteroffer that counts is which one? The one that's signed by everybody, right? None of the others mean anything. You can literally throw those away. I mean, I like to keep them for posterity, but they literally mean nothing. So you just, time and date, just typical things. We talk about the reference, the date of the original offer, and then, of course, put the basic information. These first few paragraphs are pretty important to realize kind of what drives this contract, drives this. Previous counteroffers are rejected. As soon as I send another counteroffer, any other counteroffers that were sent have all been rejected. Okay, like automatically. It talks about here the relationship between the original offer and the counteroffer, which is very important because obviously only the things that this modifies change in the original offer. So if you don't put something in, which is the part that we're going to see here in a second, if you don't fill in a new price, the price in the original offer is what stays. The effect on accepting this counteroffer, this is another one that people overlook a lot, is that when this counteroffer is signed by the buyer and the seller and a copy of the same is delivered, it constitutes a legally binding agreement. And since the original offer, including all the exhibits, this is the important piece, is incorporated by reference, only this counteroffer needs to be signed to create a legally binding agreement between the parties. So we do not need to sign any of the previous things. Now, what's the exception to that sometimes, or most of the time? Anybody know? Come on now, you guys are like the power team. Like, you guys should all know this. So if I have a contract and it has an FHA exhibit in the original offer and the seller hasn't signed it.
Any of the finance.
Not any of the financing, but the FHA one and the VA one in particular, the lender's going to need you to sign those just because they're going to want it in their file. Now, technically, by signing this counter, you have signed that, but the lender's still probably going to want you to sign the actual FHA agreement. Okay. But technically, you don't have to sign any of them in order for them to work. But, don't cause issues if you don't have to. Clean copy. This is an important one because, like I said, I just got this call yesterday from somebody that wanted to do a clean copy of a contract. And the biggest thing that kept me I told our agent, do not, under any circumstances, sign that contract or have your client sign it, more importantly. Why? Because they did not have SS 622 conformed copy of agreement in that contract, which meant that it was a completely separate contract. Like, they wrote a clean copy of the contract with no reference to the previous contract. So now I have 2 legally binding contracts. Does that seem confusing?
I'm confused.
All right, that would be really confusing. And so that's why it's very important, if for some reason somebody demands that you do a clean copy, which you can, according to this, it has to have SS 622 in it that basically says, hey, just FYI, this is a clean copy of a previously executed contract. It's not just some extra contract that stands alone
So that's a special stipulation that would be.
in the
the
clean copy. And I like it so little, I didn't even put a copy of it on the page, right? Like you would think I would pop it up here and show it to you, but it literally just says, this is a clean copy, conforming copy, actually is what they use, the conform copy of the agreement. And it therefore doesn't really mean anything if it's different than the original offer. Like anything in it is found to be different than the original offer or the bound offer, which could be an original and counter. It doesn't count.
Well, I got your sentiment. Do you see any circumstance where a conformed copy would be beneficial?
Not to me, no.
Okay.
Because the whole point of clean copies was back in the day when we did faxes and we'd fax an offer back and forth, you know,
Well, people
and
would
we didn't have a counter offer form, right? So
people
two
would
things.
initial strike
We
out.
had a faxed contract that went back and forth, and we just made the changes on the contract itself. So by the time we got to an agreement 5 or 6 tries later, you could hardly read anything on the contract, right? Like it was not legible. And so that's where, yes, a clean copy was super helpful at that point, because you do a clean copy and say, hey, this is what we think it says. Let's make sure everybody's on the same page. But it's really not necessary anymore. All right, so let's go into the meat of the counteroffer form. You will notice that it says again here, the following terms and conditions of the original offer are modified. The sections not filled in are marked in C for no change, which shall mean that no change is being proposed to that section of the agreement, shall not be a part of this counteroffer and shall remain the same as set forth in the original offer. So a lot of people believe that you have to fill in every one of these boxes. And that's a really bad idea, because I always say human error is our greatest flaw, right? We mess things up sometimes. And so we might think we're filling this out the same way that the original offer is, except for the one thing that we want to change. Like maybe we just want to change the price. All right, so we put a new price in and we think we fill in the rest of it the same way. If we mess something up on here, let's say we accidentally put 1 for due diligence instead of 10, right? We oops and forget to put the 0, we typoed. How many days due diligence, if everybody signs this, how many days due diligence are there? Just 1, right? Because this drives over the original offer. So don't change anything that you don't want to change.
Is there a benefit in putting NC?
That's in the olden days, we didn't believe that it was a good idea to have any blanks in a contract, right? And so the NCs of the world, like there's even still, I think at Dotloop, a way you can, and Remind and all the different systems, you can just tell it and it'll put NC in all the blanks that you left blank. I don't think that's necessary, in particular with this contract, because it very clearly says the section's not filled in. So anything left blank is not filled in and it doesn't matter. So just change the pieces that matter. Don't change the other things. And then of course, time limit, you need to always fill that in, because the time limit is the time limit of the counter. Okay? Questions about that block, because that's pretty straightforward. But a lot of people do fill it all in, which is not a good idea.
Sometimes I forget to check the box in earnest money, but I always get reminded.
Yes, so it's important to check the box. I do think that actually is changing, because interestingly enough, if we remember the in the purchase and sale, I think that those check boxes went away. And it's just, you know, well, you can use any of those. So we'll see if that gets changed. All right, so then of course, in addition to the normal things that you can change, the basics, you have a big block, a pretty big block. I just cut a little section of it, but you got a big block of all the, you can change special steps, you can add special steps, you know, all those sorts of things. And then of course your signature page down here, and then your signature with your buyers and seller brokers information. Now, one of the things that's important, how often when a buyer makes an offer on a property, do they get the seller's name right?
Very
Maybe
rarely.
20, 30, 40% of the time if we're lucky.
Yeah, about 20%.
So we can put in the correct seller's information on this signature page, and that corrects the issue. So one of the things, this one thing that we had the other day was that the original offer referenced some owner of whatever, which was not the correct owner. And the counteroffer was signed with the two individuals that owned the property.
Just sign?
Well, no, their names were typed in there. So it was fine, right? Because we executed the counter with the proper people. The fact that the original offer didn't have those people on it doesn't mean anything. Filling in somebody's name on a signature page is not a change to the contract. And so there's no need to, like, if that's all we were doing if we were accepting the original offer, we would have just written their names in over what the idiot buyer agent did and put in the correct information. It's fine. But if you're countering, that's also fixes it. Now, let's just quick talk about for a second. If I'm countering, or even if I'm making offers, let's talk about signature blocks, which I don't think we really did in the original, one of the first passes. When you're representing a client, do you put all of this information in there, their address and their phone number and their email address? Absolutely not. I think maybe we did talk about it, but just as a reminder, just put their name and their signature. If you represent them, this is where people need to contact, is you. So you do need to make sure you put all of your information, because as we did talk about, I know we did talk about, if you don't put a fax number here, they can't fax you notice. And that's okay if you don't want to receive notice by fax. Don't put a fax number, but do make sure you put a proper email address in here that you can receive notices, because otherwise you don't have a legal arm to receive those notices, and everybody has to deliver things in person, and that gets really annoying. So just, again, one of those things. And again, something that you fix with the counter form, right? If our friendly agent didn't put all of your information in there because they're lazy, put all of your information in here and you fix it for the original offer. All right, questions about counteroffer form?
Just for general purposes, the whole binding agreement box, does it matter who signs it or fills it in?
So remember, the binding agreement date is driven by the purchase and sale agreement. Like, it explains the way binding works. The same applies here. So it's the person binding the contract. So it's the person accepting everything and binding. So it's not like the old days where it had to go back and forth. Although I thought that was pretty effective, but whatever. All right, let's talk about a couple of bonus forms that you may not have even seen before. This is the notice to reject offer or counteroffer, which I think is a great form. If you get 30 offers on a property, because we're still in the world where if you price it right, you could end up with 20 or 30 offers, right? So you get a bunch of offers. You could, out of professionalism for all of those agents that didn't have their client win the property, you could do this real quick and just send it to all of them and say, look, you were rejected, you were rejected, you were rejected. What do you think this does from a standpoint of, if I, as a buyer's agent, get this and can give it to my buyer?
Well, it doesn't leave their offer out there indefinitely.
It doesn't leave their offer out there hanging, because it kills it, right? And it says, nope, we're done. But it also maybe gives the buyer the sense that, hey, they took the time to look at our offer and consider it, and they officially rejected it, right? So it's an interesting thought, because the next form is the request for confirmation of presentation of offer or counter offer. Anybody ever use this one? So
Never.
similarly, if for some reason you don't think that your offer, which was one of 20 offers, actually got presented, you can do this. And this says, hey, according to all these rules, right? And they cite They cite the code of ethics, they cite the Georgia law, and all of that good stuff. And you'll notice that is the signature of the requesting broker and your name, and then you get the signature of the responding broker and their name. Now, I'm not sure how really functional this is, because like for me, I want the signature of the party that the offer was supposed to be given to, right?
They know.
But that's not the way this works. This is the signature of the responding broker or broker's affiliate.
I've never seen the last two forms. How often do you see them?
Very rarely, very rarely. But we were talking about counters and things. I thought it was appropriate for us. You remember, we're deep diving, right? So we're going through everything. So these two are kind of interesting. Rare occurrence that you would use them. I do like the rejection thing better than the request for proof, because I don't think the request for proof is all that much proof.
No,
But
doesn't
it's
sound very friendly.
at least it's something, right? All right, so let's go on to terminating. Now we've gotten a binding agreement and we want to kill it.
Can we go back to the one previous?
Sure.
So for this one, it could come in handy if you are the one receiving offers and there was some tension about offers actually getting presented to the seller.
So I think in that situation, that's where you're going to want to use this notice to reject. Because if you're the one receiving the offers and rejecting them, you want to prove to the people that you actually presented them and we rejected them, I would do this one. And technically, this is the signature of the party giving notice. You could put the signature, you could put the buyer's or the seller's signature there. That would be perfectly acceptable. This does not have to be you. It can be the seller. And that, I think, is the way I would do it if there was that tension environment, because this form has to come from the person presenting the offer as a request for confirmation. You can't really deliver it as the person that received the offer going the other way.
Got it.
Okay.
Thank you.
Good catch though. Cause yeah, that's the situation. You get it. And we've been in those in recent history where people are like, oh, I don't believe, and God help you if you end up with an unrepresented buyer and everybody thinks you're totally cheating. So it's good to do these sorts of things to protect yourself, I think. All right. Unilateral notice to terminate. So this, of course, gives us the right, either the buyer or the seller. And again, right, only one of us can use it theoretically because we're terminating. Buyer or seller gives notice that we are terminating based on one of the four following things, right? First one's the easiest, buyer's right during due diligence. God help me, I have seen where the seller tried to do that. The seller filled out the form and checked A, and I thought to myself, wow, okay. So
Everybody read any.
A only applies to the buyer, right? Because the buyer is the only one that has the right to terminate during due diligence. Seller does not. And then B, of course, is the failure of a contingency. And so you just have to put in the contingency. There's no other explanation that's needed. You don't have to go into great detail about how, well, I lost my job and this, that, and the other. You didn't pass the finance contingency and you're during it and it's fine, right? The C starts to get a little bit fuzzy because now we're talking about default. So we have to call out, was there default? This one is the one that's used the most by sellers, right? Because the seller only has a couple of legitimate lawful outs of the contract, and typically they're tied to the buyer defaulting on something. So careful as you use those. Remember that most of those defaults require the opportunity to cure that default. So I requested from you the proof that you were going to be able to buy the property, right? Or whatever, proof of funds or whatever type thing. You didn't return them by the time you were supposed to. Okay. Hey, you didn't return them by the time you were supposed to. You have X number of days that's usually spelled out in whatever that contingency is to fix that and try again.
That's after they give notice.
But I have to, I, as the person that won it, have to give notice that, hey, you missed it. Like, FYI, you missed a date. I need you to fix that. And then you have X number of days. Now, not all of them are that way. And so that's why it's kind of generic to talk about. But again, just from those things. Other lawful reason is usually where people get creative. And they aren't lawful reasons. I love getting termination notices that have D checked, because 90% of the time, other lawful reason is total bullshit, right? Like, it's just completely not valid at all. So just be careful if you use that one. Make sure that it's something legitimate. I mean, there are very few things outside of the buyer's right to terminate, the failure of a contingency, or default by either the buyer or the seller that allow you to kill the contract, right? Like, there's not really other things that allow you to kill the contract, including the death of one of the parties, just FYI, goes on to the estate. So just one of those things to worry about. And then, of course, signatures of the party giving notice. And this is the top half of the form. Remember, this is a two-part form. So the bottom part of the form is now, hey, we raised our hand and said we're terminating whichever party it is. And we propose, I love that they added the proposed at some point, is we would propose that the earnest money be dispersed as follows. Be very specific, give people's names, amounts, those sorts of things. Better clarity here is better. And then this section, of course, would be signed by whoever is requesting the termination, which could be the buyer or the seller. And then it has to be signed by the other side in order for earnest money to be released. Questions about the unilateral?
I would say that if I was in the other lawful reason territory, I may opt to use the mutual termination.
Yes.
And
so,
that way there's no question of the reason, because it doesn't matter the reason.
So everybody loves to use the unilateral, right? Because, oh, well, I can just unilaterally terminate and I don't have to wait on the other people. But you know what's better than the unilateral? The mutual. Every time I can use the mutual, I'm going to use the mutual. If I'm not up against my due diligence deadline, my due diligence might be the exception. Due diligence is easy, right? Due diligence is very straightforward. Get it, we're during due diligence, you terminate it, we get our earnest money back. Okay. But anything else that there's any amount of questionable thought process, I think the mutual is a better way to go. And here's the reason why. The reason why is that the mutual agreement, if you read this nice little paragraph here, the second one, you will notice that it talks about the buyer's broker and the seller's broker and the amount of money owed to them. Because just because we terminate a contract does not mean commission is not owed. Think about that for a second. So this allows everybody, all the parties, the buyer, the seller, buyer's broker, and the seller's broker, to be able to mutually all agree that this is what we're all getting paid. Buyer's broker is getting this, the seller's broker is getting this, earnest money is being dispersed this way. And by the way, we don't have to say why we're terminating, because if we all agree, nobody really gives a shit, right?
Right. Well, I'll give you a real circumstance on this form. I had buyers in a backup contract, and it was like within a week, and everything was cleared according to the selling side. So my buyer said, "Hey, give us our earnest money back. We want to move on." And one of the sellers refused to sign it. And so I had to call Donna, and it was going to be a 10-day letter and all of that. So there's consequences beyond.
Well, in backup offers, you have to be careful because you got to make sure you write it, and we haven't done that, but that's a whole nother issue of making sure that you're protecting your client in those situations and not locking them in. So whenever possible, unless it's just due diligence, whenever possible, negotiate a mutual, right? Like, just have everybody on the same page. it's a lot easier and just simpler to make sure, because the other thing it does is it lets the buyer and the seller off the hook from the standpoint of paying any commission if they have to, right? And so everybody signs this, including the brokers, right? We didn't sign the previous one. They signed, we've signed this one, they signed that. Okay? Any questions about terminating? Because that's our whole shtick on terminating. It's just those two things.
I never noticed this part about the amount to be paid. Probably because it's just always been zero in any situation I've been in. I'm curious if that ends up being a legally binding agreement between the brokers.
So it's not, so you'll notice that the amount to be paid by the seller to the buyer's broker, or the amount to be paid by the buyer to the buyer's broker, and vice versa, by the seller to the seller's broker, and by the buyer to the seller's broker. This is an agreement between, so if for instance, you were the listing agent and the buyer's wanted to terminate, you could say, hey, as the listing agent, I get $500 for having to, whatever. I don't know how you justify that, but you could say that you get $500 for whatever. You could put that on here, and if you get the buyer to agree to pay that, then that is, yes, that is an agreement that the buyer will pay the seller's broker $500. I don't know how you would justify that, but it's
Would that
viable, I
be
guess.
earnest money dispersal?
It could if it was written in there, yes.
Yeah, so the enforceability of any promises for commission in this case would be between the buyer and the seller and the broker listed. So it's not anything broker to
It's not
broker.
broker to broker. No, it's not
You
broker
can't
to
go
broker.
complain to their agent that they never
Nope.
paid you
No,
your
This is
$500.
either
deal.
the buyer and you, or the seller and you.
Okay. Yeah,
Okay?
I could see it being a possibility in a case where maybe it went on for months and,
Yeah.
you
No,
know,
we had
used a
we
lot
had
of my
one-
time and.
We had one not that long ago that did a mutual termination because the buyers were backing out. They were just literally backing out without really much reasonable reason. And the listing agent was like, I'm gonna want my commission. And we were like, oh, okay. I guess we need to figure that out. And we were able to negotiate it down from the $30,000 or whatever that they wanted, which I was like, but you're still gonna sell the property, right? Like, and they're like, yeah. And I'm like, okay. Anyway, so we were able to negotiate it down to somewhat of a reasonable number. And actually our agent took a reasonable number from the buyers as well, because it was a whole issue. And so, yeah, we had numbers on both sides and the buyer paid both of them. So, you know, it's not uncommon, it's not unlawful, it's not unreasonable, but it's a negotiation. So you have to remember that from that perspective. Any other questions, comments on the terminations? Again, use mutual if you can. It's so much. It just ends all questions. There's no way to come back and say, well, you didn't, you know, because the unilateral, the problem with unilateral, this is the other thing. Other thing to think about with the unilateral, all right? So let me think this. I fill out a unilateral notice to terminate. And I mark on there that the other lawful reason is because I lost my job. I've seen that. Believe it or not. That's not a lawful reason, right? But as the buyer, what have I just done?
Breach the contract.
I've breached the contract. I've terminated the contract. So that's the part you have to be careful of with a unilateral. With a unilateral, if what you put down is not accurate, it doesn't matter. You still terminated the contract. Even though your reason sucked, you still terminated the contract. So that part is still a termination. It just means that your proposed dispersal of the earnest money is probably not going to work, right? Because you thought you had a good reason and you were going to get the earnest money back, But the reality is sorry, that's not a lawful reason. You still terminated the contract, even though we haven't passed closing and all those sorts of things. Contract's dead. I terminated. So I am probably not getting my earnest money back because I just terminated for a horrible reason. So things to think about when you do unilateral, regardless of whether your reason is valid or not, you're still terminating the contract. In which, if the seller is owed the earnest money because you're the buyer and you terminated for an unlawful reason, you're done. You can't come back from that. Well, can you come back from that? Aha. As we segue to the agreement to reinstate the contract, one of my favorite forms. Because just because a contract is terminated, how many times you have to terminate a contract at like 11 o'clock on the last day of due diligence because the other people are just not getting their together, right? Like it's just not right. Like they're trying to pressure you and you just don't have any more time and you're just like, whatever. I got to protect my people. We got too much earnest money on the line, yada, yada. Terminated, done, right? Contract is terminated. Contract has to be terminated. Okay, this form doesn't work if contract wasn't terminated. But I terminate it on the last day of due diligence. We stay in conversation because everybody still wants to close the deal, right? Like it's still better to have us close the deal. It's faster than having to go back on the market. You know, all the different reasons. You finally get them to see reason and they're like, okay, fine, we'll fix the window that you wanted us to fix. As an example. Then you can use this agreement to reinstate the contract and it will put the contract back into play. The key for this is that everything, number one, says that everything that was agreed upon, all of the binding, anything that's binding before is now in play, okay? Unless we change anything down here in this big open spot, right? And it's not fancy like the counter form where you get little boxes. You just got to go old school and write what you want changed. And you can change anything. Key things you want to make sure that you change. Pay attention to the closing date, right? If due diligence or any other timelines have suffered because maybe it took you a week to figure out how to get reinstated or a couple of days to get reinstated, you need those couple of days back, adjust those things in here. Adjust anything and everything that you need to adjust. It's important to make sure that you cover everything. And then that will reinstate. And of course, the bottom section, it says it's only effective if everybody have signed it, of course. And then if earnest money has been dispersed by the holder, this is another little catch. If you waited so long that earnest money actually got dispersed, then this agreement's contingent upon the buyer paying the holder the earnest money of blank within X days from reinstatement. So if, you know, you did a unilateral termination, we distributed the money, and 2 weeks later, the buyers go back and are like, look, we really want this house and sellers haven't sold it to anybody else and you figure it out, then this is the instrument that you can get earnest money back in the loop. Typically, obviously, you're going to do this probably faster than that. You're not going to release earnest money. And here's the thing. If you don't want your broker to release earnest money or the holder to release earnest money because you think you're going to reinstate, just tell them, right? Like they'll hold off for a minute. I mean, they have a certain leeway there. They don't have to immediately release it. Signed by the buyer, seller, good to go. One of my favorite forms. Any questions about the reinstatement?
You see it used often?
Not as often as it should be, because what happens is people try to write amendments to dead contracts. And so that doesn't work. So the alternate to this, the alternate to what people do instead of using this is they will literally, oh, well, I'll just write an amendment that the contract is back alive.
What
What? Right. Contract's dead. And without specific language like these things, you're probably not going to get it right. And this is my thing with amendments. Amendments are great. Blank amendment, you can do just about anything with, right? But there are forms for most things that you want to do. So like, and we haven't gone all over all of them. That's going to be maybe next week. We'll hit some of the other ones. But there are forms in GAR for changing closing date, for extending this or changing that. Like, look up the forms before you try to write an amendment from scratch. The language Seth and the forms committee put together is probably better than what you're going to write.
So without a whole bunch of changes in the blank field, this is a fast track way to get back together after you broke up.
Yep.
Contract, instead of writing a whole new contract.
Correct. So, because part of the issue with writing a whole new contract, think about it this way. If I've gone through due diligence, I've gone through 90% of finance contingency, I've gone through all of these different things, we've already negotiated an ATAC, like there's all this stuff that we did in the first offer, but for whatever reason we terminated, prior to closing. This allows us to reinstate and go back as if, and it undoes that termination with a couple of modifications. Writing a new offer and everybody agreeing to a new offer. So are you going to do 0 days due diligence? Are you going to say, like, what's the finance condition? Like, there's just, you got to reevaluate all those things. Whereas this allows you to just kind of, oh,
Never mind.
let's undo what we just did, right? We can rewind, if that makes sense. And that's usually a much simpler path than, and it's easier for people to understand because they have, you've already been in the contract, right? Like all those terms are already okay. So it's helpful from that perspective.
Not starting completely over.
Right. You're not starting completely over. All right. That was, I thought with the bonus ones, I might run long, but I know that's it. This was an easy one. I know we never have it short. These classes always run long, but I didn't want to overfill this one. But I felt like these three things kind of went together, right? We counter to get that final bind, we terminate, and we reinstate. Those are our three steps that we hopefully don't have to use other than the counter. The counter gets used a lot, obviously, and it's the way to go. Please don't do the old strikeout and change things. Like, God help you, that just is an awful way to do it, because it's hard to track and people don't do it right, because 90% of the time, even if they initial the change that they make, they don't date and time it, which means it's not really valid. So just be careful with that. That's where the counter offer form comes in. All right. Thank you guys for coming. Appreciate you. And we will hit some other forms next time, because I want to help keep pointing out that there is a GAR form for pretty much anything you're going to want to do. Forms committee has taken a lot of time to pull all those together, just like when we did the special steps. There are so many special steps, right? Like, they're pre-written. Use the stuff that's in there. Don't try to start from scratch and reinvent the wheel. There's a reason why these things are around. There's a reason why we use the things that are on there. So appreciate you all. And we will see you at the next class.
Thanks, Brett.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Brett.
Thank you. Bye-bye.